stories. Comelec declares the just concluded Barangay and Sangguniang Kabataan elections a success with voter turnout higher than in previous years. Still, there were reports of logistical challenges and some violence on the ground.
Satisfaction ratings for President Bongbong Marcos and Vice President Sara Duterte continue to plunge. That's according to the latest Octa research survey. We'll speak with Octa about what's causing that plunge later on in the program.
And heavy fighting continues in northern Gaza as Israel begins the second phase of its war against Hamas.
Welcome to the show. I'm Regina Lay.
I'm Gretchen Hong.
And I'm Denise Tan.
We begin tonight on a somber note with the Israel-Hamas war. Israel has intensified its attacks on northern Gaza, with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declaring that the war has entered its second phase.
This means ground operations of Israeli forces have expanded, with troops and armored vehicles pushing into Gaza.
Palestinians in Gaza have also reported fiercer air and artillery strikes, and the goal is believed to be so Israel can clear the way for tanks to press into the enclave. Satellite footage showed dozens of Israeli battle tanks and soldiers in the west coast of the enclave, as well as strikes on buildings. But Hamas is not backing down. It also released a video of a rocket attack on a convoy of Israel's armored vehicles. After over 3 weeks of war, the death toll has climbed to over 9,400, and more than 8,000 of that are Palestinians in the Gaza Strip.
So Israel is giving residents of Gaza 2 weeks to evacuate from the war zone. In an interview here in One News, Israeli ambassador to the Philippines, Ilan Flus, denied accusations that they are trying to occupy Gaza.
There will be no occupation by Israel of Gaza. There is no plan of occupation of Gaza. Hamas has facilities. We have to make sure those facilities do not continue to operate. The responsibility of a government is to protect its civilians.
Yes.
In this case, Hamas has launched a war against Israel.
Yeah.
Now it is our responsibility to make sure that Hamas cannot attack us again.
But for Palestinian ambassador to the Philippines, Saleh Mohammed, nothing could be further from the truth.
Why they are still in our land, why they are still making our life miserable, why they are blocking every possible peaceful initiative to withdraw from our homeland. Been under occupation since 56 years. Sorry, Israel had enough time to withdraw. Instead, they are consolidating their settlements, their illegal presence there.
Still in the Gaza Strip, the Philippine Embassy in Jordan has been able to contact Filipinos there right after the internet was shut down.
All communications
They were able
cut
to
off.
reconnect with the Filipinos. At least 87 nationals are still inside, 57 at the Rafah crossing, and 49 yet to be reached. They say that food is there, but water is the scarce resource currently.
And that's the danger, the scary thing, because
Of course.
water, clean water at that, right? Fuel as well. And you know, this issue with the being unable to cross over from the Rafah border, we've been reporting that for weeks now, right? It's getting dire by the day.
Some good news, though. The largest batch of repatriates so far at 60 came home to the Philippines. 32 hotel workers, 28 caregivers. That brings the total to 119. The DFA says 250 more Filipinos are to be repatriated next week.
Unfortunately, though, there are still 2 Filipinos that are remaining missing in Gaza. And 2 days ago, Israeli ambassador to the Philippines, Ilan Flus, also said that they are most likely, possibly kidnapped by
because
Hamas.
they haven't heard from these Filipinos. That's the problem. There's been no communication at all since fighting broke out October 7th.
Well, in other parts of the world, closer to our coastline, a question is being raised about who is the real barbarian at sea. Is it China or the Philippines? That's at the heart of a spat between a former Chinese colonel and Philippine Coast Guard Commodore J. Tariela, who got into a verbal tussle over the weekend at an international conference. Cho Po, a senior fellow of the Center for International Security and Strategy of Tsinghua University, accused Filipinos of barbarism. He cited 2 separate incidents in which a fisherman from China and another from Taiwan were killed. Joe added that PCG Commodore J. Tariela was portraying China as a, quote, devil in the region, while the Philippines, quote, almost looks like an angel.
Why were you so barbaric to kill Chinese fishermen?
Tariela, meanwhile, immediately clapped back at Cho's pronouncements.
Thank you for using the word barbaric. You keep on mentioning the word barbarism. But as I said, we abide with the international rules-based order. I think the transparency initiative that we have been espousing for the past months is a clear understanding of what the word barbarism is. Because Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Philippines will always abide with the international rules-based order. I just don't know whether People's Republic of China is also willing to do the same.
But Tariela wasn't gonna let it go. He posted on X, and I quote, "The modern-day barbarians are those who hold the belief that the domination of the world is determined solely by brute force and power, particularly when dealing with smaller and weaker nations. These so-called barbarians choose to disregard the established rules-based order and instead aim to reshape the current system through intimidation and aggression." Meanwhile, over in the U.S., Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi met with U.S. President Biden as well as Secretary of State Antony Blinken and White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan during a 3-day visit to Washington. Both sides agreed to work toward a bilateral meeting on the sidelines of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in San Francisco that begins November 11. In a statement released by China's foreign ministry, Wang said the road to bilateral meeting would not be, quote, smooth sailing and that they could not rely on autopilot to make it happen.
All right, let's discuss this with our resident foreign affairs expert, Richard Heydarian. He's also, of course, a geopolitical analyst and senior lecturer at the Asian Center of UP Diliman. Good evening, Richard. Thanks again for joining us, as always.
Good evening from, actually good morning from Greenland. Thank you.
Oh.
Pleasure.
Oh,
Good morning from where, sorry?
Greenland.
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 What are you doing there?
Yeah, actually, sabi ko bago natin pag-usapan ng Philippine DFA, let me say thank you sa Department of Foreign Affairs for helping me to get here sa Greenland kasi medyo mahirap pala pumunta dito. So,
But-
yes, let's go
But
to the
what's
discussion.
happening?
Yeah.
What's happening there?
No, there's just some marathon event and everything like that. Apparently, yung visa ko na Schengen covered Denmark but not Greenland. So I had to ask help and our folks in DFA helped to get the necessary
okay.
documents. So advisory lang, kung Pinoy kayo, may Schengen visa kayo, make sure you get it from Denmark if you want to go to Greenland or ask a special permission.
It sounds like it's quite complicated. But coming back to the topic at hand, what did you make of this latest verbal tussle? Is it just, are we just making a mountain out of a molehill, or is this another escalation?
Well, actually, I'm quite worried about the direction of Philippine-China relations. I mean, as I've written recently, there are 3 ticking time bombs now, and one of them is the second Thomas Scholl. The Philippines is pressing ahead with reinforcing our structures there, especially the Sierra Madre, BRP Sierra Madre, and China is indicating that they may respond coercively to that, even worse than what we have seen in terms of bumping into our ships and harassing our resupply missions. We also have the reed bank situation. We need to develop our resources there unless we want to face a kind of energy security problem down the road as Malampaya runs south. And of course, also in Scarborough Shoal, our fishermen are being pushed into the high seas, and that's putting their lives in peril. And we saw, a few weeks ago, a few Filipinos died because, they no longer can access their traditional fishing ground. Now, just now also, we're seeing reports that the Philippines is also kind of tethering untethering our economic ties to China in a certain sense, because all of those big infrastructure projects that were promised under President Duterte, well, nothing happened under Duterte's term, but now what we're seeing is that the BBM administration, Marcos administration, is also suggesting that China is not serious and that they're not going to waste their time, and therefore they're going to push ahead with alternative partners, including Japan, United States, and EU. Now, we can debate about whether those alternatives are really alternatives, but it looks like, economically, we are decoupling from China or de-risking from China, not in terms of trade per se, but in terms of strategic investments like infrastructure investment. And then at the same time, tensions are rising on a daily basis in the South China Sea. So now I think, ex-Chinese military officers, think tankers, pundits in their media are feeling that this is a time to make the Philippines the punching bag. No, because they don't see the Philippines. They do not respect the Philippines. They do not see us as an independent country. They see us as America's lackey. That's the problem with them. They never respected us on our own terms, and they never respected our own sovereign rights. So now that they feel there's not really much of a breach between the Philippines and China, they essentially have unleashed their attack dogs. No, so this is the situation we're seeing right now.
Well, Richard, we know that collision is not only happening at sea, but also evidently on Twitter. I mean, all the verbal tussle and this head-to-head confrontation. If you're worried about that, how then do we de-escalate or lower the temperature of these talks? I mean, given that we seem to be, or obviously we are at the losing end defensively, I mean, arms-wise. How do you propose that we do that with the aggression of China also in the words that they're using now to describe the Philippines, such as barbarism?
Yeah, and then I want to actually clarify. I think he was referring to a Taiwanese fisherman. So for him to automatically assume a Taiwanese as Chinese also says something about them, right? About not respecting also Taiwan's de facto independence from China. No, but going back to this, you're absolutely right. I mean, when it comes to asymmetry of power, clearly China is a far more powerful country. And as I've been writing and warning in past few days, one reason we should care about what's happening in the Middle East is because if there's a wider conflict in the Middle East, God forbid, then the Biden administration is going to be bogged down not in one, but two different conflicts outside of our region. One already in Ukraine. There's no indication of any peace deal anytime in the near future there between Ukraine and Russia. And Ukraine keeps on getting funding, billions and billions of dollars from the U.S. And then now we have the situation in the Middle East. If there's going to be greater conflict there, then America is going to be bogged down big time. So that makes you wonder how helpful can United States can become to us if they do not intelligently calibrate their interventions and their presence in other parts of the world, including especially the traditional theaters of Europe and the Middle East. So much for their pivot to Asia and helping us. And I think that's why President Biden came out the other day and openly said, no. If something happens in the South China Sea, we will jointly with the Philippines push back against. He didn't mention China, but we know he was talking about China and their bullying here in the South China Sea. Now, speaking of the Philippines, well, actually, I'm cautiously optimistic that we still have some leverage in this because one of the things that is not usually discussed in mainstream discussions or analysis is that may kinalaman yung ginagawa natin sa EDCA sa Taiwan sa nangyayari dito sa West Philippine Sea. In my opinion, the Chinese are looking at the linkage here. And the Chinese are worried that we'll give Americans more and more access close to Taiwan, and that will complicate their calculus in Taiwan. And now the Chinese are openly talking about invading Taiwan again, no? In the recent statements, I think they're confident U.S. is bogged down and distracted. And I think what China is doing in the West Philippine Sea perhaps is a way for us not only not to strengthen our position in the West Philippine Sea, but to also reconsider giving Americans more access close to Taiwan. So you have two very close theaters to each other. There's a Taiwan linkage there. I think this term was also used by DND Secretary Chodora, which is a very correct analysis of this. So if you're the Philippines, actually the leverage is kind of with us. So we can make it very clear to the Chinese that the more they bully us in the West Philippine Sea, the more access we're going to give Americans vis-a-vis Taiwan, and we're going to get back at them there. So correspondingly, we can ask the Chinese to be more circumspect in how to deal with the West Philippine Sea, and in exchange reassure them that the Americans will not get 10 out of 10 access to the EDCA bases or in terms of access to strategic bases close to Taiwan. So you get what I'm saying? We can do a negotiation here whereby our EDCA positioning close to Taiwan, we will leverage that to get concessions from China on Second Thomas Shoal. Let's say to the Chinese, if you keep on harassing us on Second Thomas Shoal, we're going to do something on EDCA. If you keep on harassing us in Reed Bank, we'll do this. So if we stand firm and intelligently use this linkage, this could actually be a bargaining chip for us rather than a point of weakness and bullying for China.
Richard, speaking of reassurance, we all know Wang and Biden met recently. How does that impact? I know you talked about a lot of things, even the access to Taiwan, but could this possibly really help improve the situation in the West Philippine Sea, especially since you mentioned the concern of China that we are giving or more access around the area?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, just to be clear, when I talk about EDCA, like we're not clear how many American troops will have access to the EDCA bases there. We're not clear about what weapon systems they could put there. We're also not clear how far, because we can give even more bases. We can allow the Americans to even build more facility in ports. There's discussion about building a port facility in Batanes, which is even closer to Taiwan than the EDCA bases in Isabela, Cagayan. So actually, the momentum is with us. The strategic initiative is with us. So we can use that as a leverage. Now, going back to this U.S., China, Philippine triangle, yes, President Biden just the other day, because I'm following the Chinese ambassador to the U.S. also on Twitter, there was a meeting between Biden and the Chinese envoy there in Washington, D.C. Well, the immediate context, of course, is that the United States, is trying to make sure that there are guardrails in terms of the bilateral relationship, especially as President Biden prepares to host President Xi Jinping in San Francisco, if I'm not mistaken, for the APEC summit next month in November. So in 2 weeks' time, Xi Jinping and Biden are supposed to meet. So there has to be some diplomatic preparation for them. But I think there's also a bigger picture to that. And a bigger picture to that is Biden also recognizes, despite his rhetoric, that they cannot pick fights with three enemies on three sides of the world. They cannot have enemies with Russia, in the Middle East, and China all at the same time. So the best they can do is not to succumb to these aggressive powers like Russia and China, but to put some sort of guardrails and try to manage in disputes. Like, okay, with Russia, it's kind of a semi-war situation. With China, we're not there yet, so maybe we want to calibrate that. So the U.S. doesn't have to be in your face in every theater of conflict. It can calibrate its presence depending on the needs on the ground and depending on the aggression that comes from the other side, and also depending on the level of capacity and commitment that its allies in the region should have. So actually, in the coming days, I'm going to watch out for also what other key U.S. allies like Japan, like Australia, are going to do, because how Japan acts in this part of the world is going to be very influential in shaping the direction of not only U.S.-China dynamics, but also Philippines, because Japan is one of the biggest security partners that we have, and they could become even a more important partner in coming years as we negotiate a visiting forces
Yet,
agreement
we don't
with
have
Japan.
a mutual defense treaty with Japan, though, and they've been known in recent history to avoid conflict. Do you think they will come to our aid in case this comes to, hopefully, to be a little bit more heightened than it is now?
Yeah, well, the Japanese, they don't have direct mutual defense treaty with us, but they have a mutual defense treaty with the U.S. So if U.S. gets involved in a conflict with the Philippines, they will get involved because they're U.S. ally. But more importantly, the Japanese also care a lot about the Philippines because we're next to Taiwan. Remember, the Japanese are just north of Taiwan, we're just south of Taiwan. And for the Japanese, it's a red line. If Taiwan is occupied by China, that's a nightmare for Japan too, because then they have to deal also with Japan more in your face. Okinawa is very, very close to northern Taiwan. In fact, Okinawa is as close to northern Taiwan as the farthermost Batanes Islands are to southern Taiwan. So the Philippines is important to Japan, not only on its own terms, because Japan has huge investments here, including the subway in Manila, hopefully that will come in the coming years, but Japan is also looking at the Philippines as a linchpin of a broader regional security architecture led by the United States, but with Japan essentially an upgraded Robin to the Batman of the United States. I mean, imagine a Robin, but kind of on steroids, right? I mean, kind of a stronger Robin, right? That's the role that Japan is playing in our part of the world. So it's important also to see what Japan is going to do here, because unlike the United States, Japan has its own dynamic with China. And sometimes actually Japanese know how to better deal with China despite their historical rivalry. So let's look at also the diplomatic intervention of middle powers like Japan, which, by the way, has been very crucial to development of the Philippine Coast Guard. A lot of the most advanced multi-role vessels we have, it comes from Japan. And under a new security-oriented ODA, Official Development Assistance from Japan, we're going to get more maritime security assistance from them. So this is not just a game of U.S. and China. It's also about the next tier powers like Japan and what they're going to do about the situation here. Because Japan is also very carefully following what's happening in the Middle East. If you look at their take on the Middle East, they're quite nuanced because they're also calculating the impact on us in Asia. And we also saw Japan quite active on the Ukraine issue, precisely because they want to make sure that the U.S. is not overstretched and can be also function in other parts of the world.
Richard, speaking of the tensions in the Middle East, what do you make of the Philippines choosing to abstain in the UN vote on the Israel-Hamas conflict this weekend?
Yeah, that's why I had to say the thank you to the Department of Foreign Affairs for getting myself here to Greenland, no? Before I give my comment here. Because to be honest, I'll be very honest about this, right? I was expecting that question to come earlier. To be honest, I just felt that the explanation that came from we still don't have an actual ambassador, right? I think it's Sir Antonio Lagdameo who's there, but I think it's like kind of a special position, but whatever. I just feel like the elements of the explanation were there, but I think the framing was not optimal. Because if you look at this, 120 countries voted in favor of the ceasefire, including countries like Norway, countries like New Zealand, countries like France, which is a member of the United Nations Security Council, countries like Brazil, a major democracy, and practically all Arab countries with the exception of Iraq and Tunisia, which is quite an interesting case in itself, why they voted along with us at abstention. So many Arab countries and many also key European countries and powers, they voted in favor of this because for them, the humanitarian issue is urgent. Based on the reports, thousands of children have been killed on both sides. And based on the reports that we're seeing from international humanitarian organization, we're facing a humanitarian catastrophe here in Gaza. And we could see generational anger and radicalization threat here. And not to mention, there could be a threat of escalation if West Bank also joins this conflict, if Hezbollah from the north also joins this conflict. So I'm very worried about this, and that's why I understand why 120 countries, including France, voted in favor of this ceasefire. The position of the Philippine government, I think, essentially is this. I don't think they explained it in this way, but I think what they meant was, we agree with the spirit of the resolution in terms of calling for de-escalation and ceasefire. And correctly, Mr. Lagdameo mentioned the need for lasting peace, and making sure that both Palestinians and Israelis live in peace and all. But I just felt that the explanation part should have been a little bit patched up more, because the idea that, because unfortunately, a number of Filipinos were victims of October 7 heinous attacks, right? And a number of Filipinos are still unaccounted for. But Thailand had the most number of non-Western. I think they were second highest. More than 30 of their nationals were killed in the October 7 attack. They have dozens of their nationals who are held hostage. Nepal also, more casualties, but they voted in favor of the ceasefire. So when you have countries like Thailand voting in favor, even though they had even more tragedy than us in the October 7 attack, I think it was incumbent on the Philippine government to put better articulation of why we're standing in abstention. I think India's explanation was much better if you look at how they try to explain this, to say exactly like, we agree with ceasefire, we agree with two-peace process, but we also have to, emphasize accountability for all of the kind of deliberate attacks on civilians and so on and so forth. I just felt the explanation had to be done better, because abstention may seem safe, but that it has to come with some proper contextualization and explanation. I think Canada also did the same. They also voted abstain, but the explanation, I think, was much more robust than what came out of the Philippines. So that's my friendly, constructive advice to the Department of Foreign Affairs. And I understand where they're coming from, but I think just being abstained doesn't mean you're necessarily safe, right? Or neutral, right? We have to have principled neutrality on this issue. And let's not forget, if we decide, so I'm connecting this to the other topic you asked me, if we decide to take the West Philippine Sea issue to the United Nations at some point, to the UN General Assembly, because in the UNSC, China will veto it, we need the help of those 120 countries that we didn't join in our latest UN vote. We'll need the help of many Arab countries. We'll need the help of countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, who have very strong feelings about what's happening in Gaza. So we have to make sure we do not alienate those countries, and we do not come off as just another American friend and ally. Who, you know what I'm saying? I mean, that's an important thing to keep in mind. I'm not saying that's the case. We didn't vote along with the U.S., but we have to push back against the impression that we're just voting because we are American allies, therefore we cannot be on the complete other side. No, we have to explain where we come from a principled position, considering our predicament and circumstances.
Well, here's hoping they don't repatriate you for being so frank. Thank you so much for your insights once again, Richard Heydarian.
naman ako eh.
Nandyan ka na, baka watch out
Hindi ka na
for email.
makauwi.
Political analyst and senior lecturer at the Asian Center of UP Diliman. Thanks for your insights.
Salamat.
Now up next, missing registrations and voters who couldn't find their precincts. We'll round up how the just concluded Barangay and SK elections right after this. Keep it here on One News.
back. You're still watching Big Story here in One News. Well, millions of Filipinos across the country trooped to polling centers to elect a new set of barangay leaders today. It's been a long day for us. We've had wall-to-wall coverage beginning from this morning.
That's true.
And that's the reason why we weren't actually able to vote, sadly.
Well, things that I took note first times for these elections. One is the PDLs, persons deprived of liberty, got to vote. We also had an assistance or an early voting for senior citizens, PWDs, and the pregnant women. We had pilot testing of automated elections in 3 barangays. But I think this morning, the main problem that was touted by residents was they couldn't find their precinct number.
Exactly. Exactly.
Long lines because of that.
And there were also some people who couldn't find their names in the list, right? And they're certain that they registered, but they show up to the precinct and suddenly their names are not there. So we don't know what went down there. We asked in the afternoon. We spoke to Comelec spokesperson Attorney Laudianco, and he said that they should be there. So we're going to try to look into it.
It has been 5 years after all since the last barangay and Sangguniang Kabataan elections. Probably some barangays have a new precinct numbers. Some residents have transferred to other barangays and all those things.
Well, in the case of the Embos, you get a whole new city.
Yun pa, isa pa yun. Oo, pero hindi pa rin nawawala yung election violence, vote buying incidents, and we heard all about that today. Things did not go all that smoothly in the Bangsamoro region in particular, with shooting incidents reported. Over in Datu Udin Sinsuat, 2 were reported dead, while 5 others were injured a few hours before voting started. According to initial reports, there had been a commotion between the camps of 2 opposing candidates in Barangay Bugawas. A shooting also took place in Pandag, Maguindanao del Sur, stopping voters from casting their votes. In Cotabato City, police had to step in as electoral board members after several teachers opted to not serve these elections. A bit of commotion also rocked Cotabato City Central Pilot School, with people trying to force their way against the crowd.
Balik naman tayo sa NCR. Over in some of the Embu barangays, hindi talaga naiwasan yung confusion ng mga botante. A lot of it has to do with finding their names on the voters list, yan yung sinabi natin kanina, as well as their precincts. Recall that a few months ago, the Embu barangays have been transferred to the jurisdiction of Taguig from Makati.
Up north, the president didn't have much trouble casting his vote, though, at the Mariano Marcos Elementary School in Batac, Ilocos Norte. In fact, he was quite the early bird, going in as soon as the precinct opened and casting his vote in more or less 5 minutes. He was also game for an interview, telling reporters about the importance of the barangay elections this Senate.
Pag sinabi ng mga barangay na magde-deliver ako sa iyo ng 350 votes dito sa aking barangay, asahan mo 350 yun, totoo yun. Kaya napakahalaga ng resulta nito para sa aming mga politiko, napakahalaga ang resulta ng barangay election. Talagang crucial 'yan at it is held at a very intimate personal level. And that's why sometimes nagkakainitan ng husto, kaya yun ang ating gustong iwasan.
Though the Barangay and Sangguniang Kabataan should remain non-partisan, the Comelec explains the sentiment from the president. Let's hear it from spokesperson Rex Laudianco.
We see nothing of a problematic po dito or any issue that will come out of it. Ang nakita lang po namin dito is an expression of a reality. It's a fact. Dahil nga po yung nature ng village elections, yung barangay elections, lahat po ng pinamumunuan niya, kaibigan, kababata, kabag-anak, kapitbahay, kakilala, talaga pong pagdating po sa larger scale ng government, sila po ang magsasama.
Well, political analysts also say that the BSK sets the ground for the midterm and national elections, and that's why it's so crucial, since it's the barangay leaders who will deliver the votes from the ground up.
We look at basically these barangay officials as political power brokers of the people at the community level to the patron identifying key government officials or positions for that matter, being able to align themselves into whosoever it is going to support them, especially at this particular elections. Going to be a very expensive, and we're looking at a more expensive 2025 elections for that matter.
Now, as far as the DILG and poll watchdog PPCRB are concerned, this year's BSK elections have been generally peaceful. They did acknowledge the crimes reported in areas like the Barm, although they said authorities were able to manage the situation on time.
Kung titignan mo, generally, lalo na sa NCR maganda, no? Napakatahimik. Pero kung titignan mo, very proactive ang kapulisan. Marami silang nahuhuli na mga vote buying, no? Vote buying, talaga sinisita nila.
Generally, okay, peaceful, and also orderly, except for a few incidents where voters difficulty of finding their names in the voters list.
You know, a while ago, I was listening to your conversation about the barangay elections being non-partisan. And ang explanation pala doon ay dahil hindi naman kailangan ng partido, dahil kamag-anak mo, kapitbahay mo,
it's people you know.
mo, it's community. It's supposed to power the elections. And speaking of, no, hindi tayo nakaboto, pero alam mo kung sinong bumoto sa amin. Yung driver ko, iniwan ako talaga para bumoto sa may
that's good.
Sa may batasan. And I was asking him, kilala mo ba yung bubotohin mo? Oo, kilala niya.
May listahan siya.
Kilala
You
ko
wrote it
naman
down.
niya. Yes,
Kasi
he
manual
knows.
tayo this year.
Yes, and he didn't want to be parang this, ang tawag dito, mawala yung pangalan niya doon sa listahan. Kapag may ayuda. And speaking of ayuda, alam nyo ba na hindi rin biro yung natatanggap na pondo ng mga barangay na maaaring gastusin ng mga opisyal nito? Just to give you an idea, these are the funds that barangays get under the law. Barangays get 20% of the tax allotments from the national government along with other bigger units of government. If you can't picture 20%, just imagine that out of every 5 peso tax allotment to LGUs, 1 peso of that goes to barangays. For example, out of the 1 trillion peso internal revenue allotment to LGUs in 2022, 200 billion of that went to your barangays. Hindi lang Congress ang may power of the purse, pati barangay councils pwede ring mag-impose ng fees. Through local ordinances, barangay leaders can adjust all kinds of fees. Let's get Barangay Bel Air in Makati, for example. They had 256 million pesos in budget last year. Kaya kung tutuusin, milyonaryo po ang ilan sa mga barangay leaders natin. Siyempre, pagdating sa pondo po yan. Where did all that money come from? A bulk of it is from real property tax, where barangays also get a share. Next is the tax allocation, or the IRA, as it was formerly called, from the national government. A big chunk of that budget goes to maintenance and operating expenses and personnel services, or the honoraria given to barangay officials. At hindi lang po yan, meron din silang discretionary fund. The budget department says this fund is, quote, for public purposes and for other miscellaneous expenses related to the official functions of the punong barangay. Well, is there a limit to this allocation? Well, yes. The DBM said it should not exceed more than 2% of the real property taxes logged for that year. A lot of money.
Indeed. So kahit na technically the salaries are small, and in fact some of them are barely minimum wage, there's a lot of power involved in these positions.
And just as how our politicians have framed it, no, it influences the midterm elections, then that influences the national elections.
Exactly.
So power and money. Well, up next, President Marcos and VP Sara Duterte both saw their performance ratings plunge yet again, this time in a survey conducted by Octa Research. We'll deep dive into the latest figures with Octa Research fellow Guido David when the big story returns. Keep it here.
You're watching the big story here on One News. The satisfaction ratings for President Bongbong Marcos and Vice President Sara Duterte continue to slide. Just last month, they suffered double-digit drops in Pulse Asia's survey. And now, in Octa's most recent Tugon ng Masa survey conducted from September 30 to October 4, the president's trust ratings went down by 3 percentage points to 73%, while his performance rating slid 6 percentage points to 71% from the second quarter. But it's Vice President Sara Duterte that suffered a more significant drop, with her performance rating seeing a double-digit decline of 12 percentage points to 70%, while her trust rating saw an 8-point drop to 75%. Across major areas, Marcos's performance ratings declined the most in the NCR at 12 points to 61%, while Duterte's lowest drop in performance was recorded in Visayas, down 16 points from 90% in the second quarter to only 74%. But numbers are rosier for leaders of Congress, with House Speaker Martin Romualdez seeing a 6-point jump to 61% in performance rating, while Senate President Juan Miguel Zubiri is up by 1 point.
To help us make better sense of these figures, we have with us on the show Octa Research Fellow Professor Guido David. Good evening.
Hi, good evening, Gretchen, Regina, and Denise.
Hi, Prof. Can you give us an idea of what happened between July and October that led to these significant drops? Is it just confidential funds, or are we seeing something else here?
Well, you mentioned confidential funds, and I was looking at the Google Trends for confidential funds, and the peak of the the discussion, if we're looking at the Google Trends, occurred during the last week of September towards the first week of October. And that's exactly when we had our survey conducted from September 28 to October 4. It's a nationwide survey with 1,200 respondents. So the confidential funds topic may have been a factor in the decrease in the numbers of the vice president. And as for the president, we believe that, well, I mean, the questions are asked is, so we don't really ask the respondents what their reasons are. But, you know, these are performance ratings. And we see a gap in the performance and the trust ratings. So their trust ratings are higher than their performance ratings. So what that means is that the people continue to trust them. But they're saying, okay, this is what you said you will do. We want you to deliver on your promises. And so far, we're still seeing inflation rates still high and prices of goods still high. And, you know, we're still seeing access to basic food and goods to be a continued concern. So we believe that they may be factors in the response of the respondents.
Prof, President Marcos declined in single digits, 3% down siya, but you know that is still a significant decline. Pulse Asia attributed the decline they reported earlier this month to rising price commodities. Yun pa rin ba? Is that still the main concern?
3 percentage points, yeah.
Yes, yeah, and actually I think it's about 2, maybe 2 to 3%. But yeah, I think it's a concern because, you know, as the president, you promised to deliver something, and the people are holding them to their, you know, promise, or at least to this standard, that they want to see prices of goods decrease and to have access to, you know, goods. Of course, you know, the issue is very complicated. It's an international concern. Fuel prices are rising, and that's causing everything to rise. And but we're also seeing, you know, sometimes some products like rice and sugar or onions become inaccessible at times, become very expensive. And I think that this may have been a factor that contributed to these. And these numbers are elastic, by the way. And we can't say that there's a trend of a continued decrease, because we believe that if these concerns are addressed by our administration, that their numbers will probably recover at some point. So, kumbaga, you know, just like if you're a student in class, you know, this quarter maybe your grades are not so high, but that doesn't mean that your grades will be lower next time. You can still recover and still make up for it.
How is it that we're seeing bigger drops for VP Sara Duterte? Does that point to the fact that Filipinos are now judging them separately and not as a unit?
Well, that could be it. They may have been looking at them previously as a unit, especially during the first year of the administration. But now there's sort of a separation that's happening. I mean, this is inference or speculation, but the numbers do show that the decreases are happening disproportionately at this time.
Just taking a look, we don't want to compare their performances because they're very far, but father and daughter and the Duterte brand, we know that to be strong over the past years. With your experience doing these surveys during the Duterte administration time and the current vice president, what can you say? I mean, comparing the two.
Yeah. Well, it's difficult to make comparisons. It's almost like apples to oranges, Gretchen. But the former president Duterte enjoyed very high performance and trust ratings during his term, except towards the end, and that was affected by the pandemic. I think he enjoyed 90% trust and performance ratings throughout. Now, putting these numbers into context, we can still say that these are still higher numbers. VP Sara is still seeing trust and performance ratings that are about 7 to 8 out of 10 Filipinos. So within that range. So it's not low per se. So there's just a decrease in the numbers. But like I said, these numbers are elastic and they may recover at some point. So it may have been a factor or affected by what happened during the past month with what happened with Congress.
Prof, iba naman yung naging storya kay House Speaker Romualdez. He was the one who saw the highest jump among top officials. Dahil ba to dun sa removal ng confidential funds?
Well, it's hard to say per se, but there's another number that we did show, and I'm not sure if I should be talking about it, but when I looked at the trust and performance of the Senate and the Congress, they both increased actually during this period. So maybe the series of events affected not just them, but the upper house and the lower house as well. So, we've been noticing that usually some government institutions rate the ratings are very highly correlated with the ratings of their respective leaders. So yeah, maybe these have been factors. What happened with Congress over the past month that may have contributed to their increase in numbers.
We did see also during that time period that the voice of our upper and lower chamber could change, also in the blink of an eye, with public pressure. Meanwhile, may iba naman po tayo, Professor. Balikan ko lang natin yung mga pinag-usapan natin in the past years, COVID-19. Kasi may nababalitaan namin, may umiikot daw na bagong flu. Have you been tracking this? Have you been getting anyone to contact you to do the numbers? Anong balita natin doon? Pulso natin. Tsaka COVID-19 numbers right now.
Yes. Gretchen, hindi naman natin na-miss yung COVID-19 for sure, right? But but we want to stay informed. And actually, we continue to track COVID-19 numbers. We had a very slight uptick the past few months, actually, and positivity rate reached up to 7%. But in context, that's a relatively low positivity rate. It's still above 5%, but it's not as high as it was once. And now we're seeing upticks in different kinds of diseases, not just COVID, but I believe the Department of Health called them ILI, influenza-like illnesses. So yes, we are seeing similar symptoms, I think flu outbreaks. And we heard about schools closing, going back to online classes, and some works being suspended because of these influenza-like illnesses.
Pero wala pa tayong numbers dyan, Professor?
Yung sa influenza-like illnesses, we don't have the hard numbers because we don't record them. We do have the COVID numbers. They're not as high as they once were. They did see an uptick, but now it's downward. looking at the Google Trends, we don't see a significant increase. There was a slight increase in symptoms that are related to flu. So there was an uptick, but I think we're not seeing, we don't have the same monitoring that we had over the past, in 2021 and 2022. So I think that's sort of gone away. And without the data to analyze, we don't have much to work with.
Kasi wala tayong pang-test nun, ano? All right. In the meantime, maraming salamat po. Thank you so much for your time tonight. We have Octa Research Fellow, Professor Guido David.
Thank you.
In other news, the untimely death of Friends actor Matthew Perry continues to dominate talk on social media. U.S. media are saying Perry died from apparent drowning in a hot tub in his L.A. home, and he was 54. Authorities said there was no sign of foul play and that the cause of his death will be confirmed at a later date. Perry previously opened up about his struggle with drug and alcohol addiction in his memoir published last year. Aside from Friends, Perry also starred in other films and series like Almost Heroes, The West Wing, and Mr. Sunshine. In a statement, the team behind the sitcom wrote, "We are devastated to learn of Matthew Perry's passing. He was a true gift to us all. Our heart goes out to his family, loved ones, and all of his fans." Aside from photos and clips of his character Chandler Bing in Friends, fans are also sharing an interview excerpts of Perry talking about how he wants to be remembered. He said he's grateful that people talk about Friends, but he says, "When I die, it would be nice if Friends were listed far behind the things I did to try to help other people." Perry said in that interview that he has always been eager to help out fellow people struggling to keep clean.
An era.
Reruns are going to be so different now.
I know.
Exactly. That's what people are posting. They're saying that all the memes hit different now.
I can't get myself to rewatch the show,
I
actually.
feel a lot of us have had Chandler save us from dire times.
That was our, that's right. We grew up watching them. 10 long years.
But I'm glad that they had the reunion
one last
year.
time.
Yeah, one
right.
last time at least. And before the passing, our hearts go out to all, I guess, the relatives and fans and those who loved Matthew Perry.
Now, on a lighter note, and before we go, time now for our big pictures for tonight. It's tamarals in the wild. The Environment Department recently shared photos of the elusive tamaral in Mount Iglitbaco National Park. It is a protected area and an ASEAN Heritage Park in Mindoro. Tamarals are known to be endemic in the island and are considered critically endangered. October of every year has been declared as a special month for the conservation and protection of the tamaral in Mindoro.
Here's hoping they multiply. Right?
Gusto ko
That's a
yung
good sign.
Gusto ko ito yung nire-report natin at hindi yung pagkatalo ng Ateneo sa UP. Oh, okay na yun. Tama na ko
So sad.
Ayoko na mag-comment
UST.
sa ano ko, alma mater ko.
Go Tamaraos!
Ayun na yung mga biases.
All right, and that is the show for tonight.
We are One News, all sides, all the time.
Thanks for tuning in. Have a good night.